All right. When we're talking about proportionality, you always, anytime you discuss something, and this is the simplest way I can think of saying it. Let's say we have we're trying to measure two things, right? And we're talking about proportions. Anytime we're talking about proportion, we're always going to be looking at the relationship between two things, right? What's the relationship between these two things, right? What's the correlation between these two things? And I can go on and say this is taller than this is shorter than this is thicker than this is, and so on and so forth. Well, with respect to war, we're going to have, and this is part of the discussion that I've already posted a video on, John Stuart Mills, right? We have means, M-E-A-N-S, and those means have an end state. The means, we have to make sure, are justified by the end. What is the end in battle? Well, it's simple. The end in battle is victory. Right? So we want victory. Right? Victory. Now there might be many other ends. You might be actually going to war to emancipate a people. Right? So you might say during World War II, despite the fact that Japan bombed, or attacked rather, Pearl Harbor, another motive for the United States engagement in that war was to emancipate many of the Jewish people who were in concentration camps once information got back to the States that, you know, this is what was going on, right? Nevertheless, the whole point is to win at what you're doing, right? So victory is the end state, right? Now, what are the means that we use to get to this, right? So again, we're looking at two different things. What are the means that we use to get to victory? Well, we have to make sure that those means are just. So when we're talking about just, and I've read and I've listened to academics and students do discussions on just war theory, and this is where there's a confusion, right? That this is often confused. The justice that we're talking about in relation to number 5, in relation to proportionality, pertains to the means, right? Are your means justifiable, right? So it's important to recognize that when we're talking about justice with respect to proportionality, we're specifically talking about, are your means justifiable? So for example, and here goes a spoiler alert. So if you haven't watched Watchmen, I'm going to spoil the movie for you, and now's the time for you to stop the video or fast forward or whatever. But there's a great scene at the end of Watchmen where you realize the whole point of the movie was to say, I want to make a better world. But in order to make a better world, right, my end state, in order to make a better world, I'm going to have to kill a whole lot of people. Right? Is that justifiable? Well, it depends on what tool of analysis you use. If you use a utilitarian ethic, maybe. If you use a Kantian ethic, a deontological ethic, maybe not. If you use a virtue ethic, maybe. It depends on what ethic you implement, and this is why people think philosophers never get anything done, because, you know, it's depending on what tool of measurement you use, you're going to have a different response, and people go for days arguing back and forth, but you get the idea. The idea is we have to make sure in discussing proportionality that we attribute justice to the means and not the end, right? Are your means justifiable? The end state, victory, could arguably be attained without unjust means. And what's best in military engagement is to make sure that victory is always attained by the most just, right, means. Okay, and then lastly, number 6, and this is a last resort. You have to make sure that it is a last resort. All right, with respect to a last resort, and it's obviously self-explanatory, right? You want to make sure that there are no other alternatives, right? Have we used our dignitaries, right? Have we used our ambassadors? Have we used our diplomats? Have we sent peacemakers and peacekeepers? Have all of those things failed? If all of those things have failed, if every preventative measure to de-escalate violence and conflict has failed, then war might be the last resort. What the last resort says is that we have to make sure that anytime we're engaging in battle, that there really are no other alternatives. So with respect to the conflict between the United States in any nation, or any nation and another nation, you want to make sure that you've exhausted all possibilities. The best way, the most effective way to prevent war, and it's often the most overlooked way of preventing the war because it's the simplest way, is to make sure that you engage in diplomacy, right? Once diplomacy fails, once there is no more diplomacy, right, there isn't even the condition with which we can speak to one another as human beings, as leaders of nations, as leaders of militia or military forces or armies or whatever. Once that has failed, then there really is nothing else that can be done, right? Violence is going to occur. You know, I'm very pragmatic in that sense. I definitely believe that we should be pacifists, right? I believe that in a utopic society, there should be no violence. However, I also recognize the reality of it all, which is there's always going to be an aggressor, and sometimes that aggressor can be de-escalated, right? You can de-escalate the violence and calm the situation through diplomacy. Most leaders, however, don't use diplomacy because it's not easy, right? It takes an incredible knack and understanding of culture and diversity to be able to humble oneself and humble one's nation to prevent war. But sometimes even that fails, and then you'll be engaged in battle. Okay, so this section concludes the pre-war state, right? Jus ad bellum. So these are the 6 criteria for going to war. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at sort of the criteria to discuss when we're actually in war, right? When we're actually engaged in battle. And those will obviously be different from these. These 6 criteria, when met, after I've checked off each of them, then I can say with confidence as a sovereign nation that I am justified in engaging in this battle because I have just cause, I have gone through the proper authority, my intentions are just, which I think is a little skeptical. There's a good possibility for military success. I have recognized that I'm going to use justifiable means. And then lastly, this is the last resort. Diplomacy has failed, and now it's time for battle. Okay. All right, the next thing that we can discuss, as we said, do not pertain to a pre-war state, right? So now we're no longer talking about pre-war states. What we're going to talk about now is the actual conflict, right?